Staying with the pulse. Now, the DA's campaign posters in Durban have caused widespread anger after standing by the slogans which read, "The ANC called you racist and the DA calls you heroes." The party has taken down the posters. It was referring to the racial tension which flared up in Phoenix during the civil unrest in July. At least 30 people died in that violence in the township. Where does running the sort of campaign leave the DA now? Well, that's the question we're going to try and answer. Political analyst Levy Ndou and Dr. David Rothenstein, who's a behavioral scientist at the Anti-Disinformation Project. Good evening to both of you, gentlemen. Perhaps, Dr. Ndou, let me begin with you. From a political perspective, right, we've seen what is effectively a big U-turn in the past 24 hours from the DA when it comes to the messaging around those posters. First, their leader defended them, vehemently so, and now they're saying, well, they didn't have the approval of the senior leadership and that this was a decision that had been taken by, effectively, the leaders in that particular ward and district. What are we to make of all of this?
Evening, Kathy. Good evening to my colleague and the viewers at home. You know, when you are at the election period, you have to do all you could to be able to attract voters towards your party or to ensure that they vote for your party. And to a certain extent, some people would actually come up with other strategies that might, to a certain extent, disadvantage their program. In this case, it is the Democratic Alliance. When the leadership of the DA was questioned yesterday about the poster, it appeared as if they sat down and agreed on what was actually going to appear on the poster. And we all have a perception that leaders of political parties would know the details that are happening in the different wards and the branches. And that is not the case. But when you look at how they actually then had to make a huge U-turn, it would be informed by a number of factors. Each time you mention racism in South Africa, you actually touch on the nerves and the nerves of those that were the victims of racism in the past. And when you also talk about racism in South Africa, some people get reminded about that race, and the unfortunate part as well is that each time when you have words that relates to racism coming from the DA, some would then also relate to what other leaders who left the Democratic Alliance have been saying about the party. And I think the DA has taken a decision to say this has become a very sensitive issue, and it is a better move to withdraw or to remove those posters, because it is also an indication that they actually heard what the people on the ground were saying, and in responding positively to the concerns of the people, they actually said the best thing is then to remove those posters. That is what a party that listens to the people would do.
David, there's no secret about the fact that race becomes and remains a sensitive conversation in this country. Following the July unrest, the situation in Phoenix was highly charged, particularly along racial lines. I mean, from the perspective of putting a campaign like this together and being able to read the room, can we actually say that, you know, that it wasn't preempted, that nobody who was putting this messaging and this campaign together would have thought about that the fact that this would be the outcome?
Absolutely. You know, using racism, or not necessarily using it, but those are very emotive emotive messages have quite a strong impact on people. And I think putting your messaging across and using those kinds of emotive strategies as a means to communicate it's not necessarily communicating disinformation, but it can be. I mean, people respond quite emotively to that. And if you're trying to be objective in your campaign or your strategy, you can lose that objectivity as well. And people, I mean, racism, I think, touches the hearts of a lot of people. It has very deep, strong historical aspects to it. And, we've seen in some of the disinformation, one type of disinformation strategy or, in messaging strategies are to start off with something quite emotive to rile up or arouse someone into quite an emotional state. So their decision-making actually changes. And if we're making decisions based on information that's more emotive, our decisions tend to be quite different than if we met with information that we're receiving that's more objective. That's maybe potentially more factual. If we're emotive, we sometimes lose the facts, and that's quite problematic. And I think in this case, these kinds of, messaging which uses these sort of issues, which are, it's very, as I said, quite emotive and very provocative for people. It can be potentially, you can lose a lot of objectivity.
And certainly when one looks at what was said on those posters, it was meant to be provocative. It was meant to, evoke some level of emotion from whoever the reader would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's sort of an agenda that you want to sort of ally with people on their emotional connection, have people ally with you because you maybe empathic to their cause, or you understand that cause on an emotional level, especially things like racism or xenophobia or other very emotive issues. And, a person may feel allied, but you're not necessarily representing them with an objective position. And I think that, appears to potentially or very actually be the case here in this particular situation. So it's not a great strategy. It's not really always effective to people out there. And I think people should take note of those kinds of messages. And I think in this case it was really realized, but there is other messaging out there that also relies on these, starting off with these kinds of emotive strategies, like even, for example, in COVID and in political campaigns, like alluding to people's suffering and difficulties and hardships, at the outset of your messaging, it's very difficult to then look at other information objectively because you're already now quite worked up and emotional about it. Yeah.
Ms. Ndou, let me wrap up with you and perhaps ask, what do you think is the biggest lesson to be learned out of all this?
Well, I think what is more important is this, that political parties should be able to run their campaigns freely and ensure that they communicate in the most easiest way, but they should not campaign or put signs or posters that has a potential to offend citizens or even other political parties. What political parties should actually focus on is to make provisions, maybe a list of what they are capable of doing in case they are elected into government. We have got a very difficult past in South Africa, and one would expect political parties to be at the forefront of ensuring that they participate in building social cohesion in the country and not have this kind of posters like the DA has actually put. But on a positive note, I think the Democratic Alliance has learned from this exercise, hence they've removed the posters, and it has also provided a good lesson to other political parties and South Africans in general, that we need to do things in a much better way.
I will have to wait and see if this mistake, in fact, is not a costly one when it comes to the vote on the 1st of November.